One of the things that has flown under the radar of many is a recent law that has been passed, or at least agreed upon, rather, in Germany. This law in German is referred to as the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, or the Network Enforcement Law in English, hence the title. And there are a couple of interesting points to be made here. One point I'd like to make at the outset is that, as is pointed out in the article, which I will be linking below, and you can check it out and read it. It's in German, but I'll sort of translate roughly the last line. The guy writes, considering the gravity of the law or the far-reaching consequences, the debate concerning it was fairly weak and poorly attended. So what this does, basically, is punishes posts and speech on social media platforms, and it's called technically, or rather not so technically, the Facebook law. So I guess Facebook would be a primary target, and there's probably a good reason for that. If many of you remember, in 2015, I believe it was autumn of 2015, Merkel, the chancellor, was caught on a hot mic with Mark Sugarmountain, the owner and ruler of Facebook, and caught on a hot mic discussing details of how, quote-unquote, hate speech and various things said against her could be combated. Now, it should be obvious that Facebook would be a major platform for this, but not just Facebook. Who knows how social media is defined here? I would reckon, although it's not really listed, that Twitter would be considered social media as well in this context, and various other platforms. And some things are rather obvious. There's a discussion on freedom of speech, the freedom to express one's opinion, etc., etc. Obviously, the lawmakers who pass this and the people in cahoots with them, they don't really care about that, and certainly Mark Sugarmountain doesn't care about that either. And one thing that shouldn't surprise either, although it should be pointed out, is of course that the general public, as has been pointed out, that the debate itself was poorly attended by the public and people outside of politics. They don't really care either. Now, the relevant and salient point to be made here, I think ultimately, is not that this occurred, because that shouldn't be very surprising at all, given the Sugar Mountain Merkel event. But I guess the point I want to make here is, once again, not surprising at all that this happened. Obviously, it's a real danger, because what hate speech is defined as is really anybody's guess. I mean, if we go by the conversation that was caught on a hot mic, well, I guess things that criticize Merkel, or certainly things that are out of the ordinary, such as MGTOW-related thought, alt-right, or even more mildly, cultural warriorism, Sargon-esque types of stuff. Well, this, like I said, not surprising. The main point I want to make here is a point of reactivity. The question that we have to pose is why people don't react to it. Why was the debate concerning this so mild and so weak? And why was the public so disinterested in it? The problem I see with modernity as a whole is people cannot be reactive to certain events because they haven't experienced things that lead to reaction. And there are many examples of this. For example, my father spent a good chunk of his childhood in war-torn Europe. And so he picked up the habit, a habit that, of course, was strange to me growing up and strange to many people who grow up in abundance and have food everywhere, that you don't waste food. You never throw it away. In fact, you stuff yourself till you explode if need be, because you never know when food might not be there. And so for the rest of his life, he consumed everything and never threw away food, never wasted it. A habit that stuck with him has stuck with him until this day. Then there are people who go through the Depression or who had gone through the Depression, and they become the worst penny pinchers ever. And by that I mean not thrifty people, but people that save their hordes beyond the grave. And then, of course, you have intellectual streams of thought. Ayn Rand is a good example. I mean, she grew up during many upheavals in Russia, faced a lot of prejudice. And then, of course, when the Bolsheviks took over, they took over her father's business and ruined him, basically. And is it any wonder that she came up with this strange and interesting, at times, hyper-individualistic philosophy of objectivism? And then there's Hayek, who wrote The Road to Serfdom, based on his observations of National Socialism and other things. But what I'm getting at here is that people can only react to things and take up action if they've gone through certain experiences. And as laughable as the example I'm about to give you might be to your ears, bear with me. What would it take for people to be engaged on this issue and to actually care about the possible prosecution of hate speech laws, which I should have mentioned earlier? These posts that are deemed hate speech need to be removed within 24 hours. And if they're not, you can face a penalty, a hefty monetary penalty of up to an astounding 50 million euros. Now, I don't know about you, but I think most of us cannot afford to pay 50 million euros. That is just, that's a lot of money. But what would it take for people to actually pay attention to these various resolutions and hate speech and, well, the redefinition of hate speech, which is a very fluid term anyway? So let's imagine that all of a sudden pictures of organic cupcakes and fancy, expensive dinners paid for by girls' boyfriends and travel pictures and holidays paid for by the fathers of spoiled girls and women, that these fell into the category of hate speech and became qualified and defined as hate speech. And let's say these poor females had to suffer for a decade or even longer through this. And then at some point in time, this was repealed, and the new younger generation of spoiled young females could, of course, post their cupcakes, organic cupcakes, and strawberry peppermint lattes. And then there was another instance of, well, we're going to ban hate speech. That generation that had gone through that previously, that could not post their travel log pictures and culture of food and travel nonsense, they would be up in arms about it, and they would pay attention because you have to experience things. My father would not have picked up the habit of never throwing away food if he hadn't gone through wartime experience, which was further exacerbated by service in the army during the Vietnam era, I have no doubt. So what I'm getting at is pretty simple. The passive nature of basically everyone these days is a consequence of overabundance, of having access to everything you want. And only people concerned with abstract principles, which are, we have to admit, these people are rarities, actually care about the things like this. Of course, it could affect your bottom line. If you're a Sargon of Akkad who uses Twitter and various social media platforms, and you want to post something incredibly mild. I mean, the idea, for example, that Sargon is a promoter of hate speech when he's totally anodyne and just innocuous, and I mean, he's a total centrist, is insane, but it could affect him in that regard. But even beyond that, there are very few people concerned about abstract principles. And my fear is that the passiveness of the current generation will allow for a lot worse than a network enforcement law. And to be fair, Facebook is a private platform, and so Sugar Mountain can do whatever he wants with it, presumably. That isn't really anyone's business other than his, but it certainly sets a precedent. This is mentioned in the article that if Germany goes through with this, then other countries, less quote-unquote democratic countries, might see this as a grand opportunity to say, hey, look, Germany's doing this, we can do it too. And it kind of reminds me of, coming home and you getting into trouble as a child saying, well, Timmy was doing that too. But it definitely sets a possible precedent, and I think there's an extreme danger here. And there's a more fundamental issue here. If human action in and of itself is based on prior experiences, hardship, real hardship, or at the very least difficulties, then what can we do with none of this? I mean, think about the phenomenon of MGTOW and the manosphere in general, more broadly. Things such as PUA-ism, the various strains of MGTOW earlier thought, repeats the same stuff we talked about earlier. If we had not observed certain misalignments in the relationship between males and females in the current year, and looked at that and examined that, where would we be? It wouldn't exist if everything were peachy keen. It's not, and it hasn't been for a long, long time, but it's just food for thought. I mean, everything of consequence is reactive. People's behavior, they develop behavioral patterns due to certain incidents in their lives. But without that, the question arises, how can we even instill the desire to be reactive in these people? And this goes for just about everyone who is passive and who does not really pay attention to the details. The details being here, of course, hate speech can be whatever they want it to be. And of course, I seriously doubt that Facebook and others are going to ban pictures of organic cupcakes and raspberry peppermint chocolate lattes, because that's not considered hate speech in the current year, and I doubt it ever would be. And these people who post these things are not particularly critical or even politically inclined, but there is a real danger nonetheless, and I think it's something that needs to be borne in mind. And this is not meant to be a remarkable video, but it is meant to point out something that not many people have paid attention to. And this is incredibly consequential, particularly as pointed out in the article, because it sets a precedent not just for so-called non-democratic nations, but basically everyone. They say, well, Germany did it. Maybe they can do it in the UK, which effectively has de facto hate speech laws anyway, in some sense. I mean, there are plenty of things you just, quote-unquote, shouldn't post on Facebook or other social media platforms. It's just the official factor is what's disturbing. And you have a passive, regressive population that really, once again, only cares about fancy, expensive dinners and posting pictures of travel and food and culture. Yeah, it's not going to end well one way or another. And I think one thing we can, as I draw this video to a close, observe from the preponderance of evidence from history is that it rarely stops at one thing. It rarely stops at, this type of speech is bad, so we're going to, jettison this and it'll be penalized. No, it usually moves on to some other thing. And maybe, just maybe one day, those coconut mango peppermint lattes and the fancy dinners and the pictures of your travel in Naples as a female that your father paid for, maybe those two will be banned because they demonstrate too much exploration and freedom of movement. I mean, who knows? This is definitely not heading in a positive direction, and this definitely needs to be talked about. At the very least, it should be brought up and mentioned. So everyone, thanks for tuning in, and I will check you out later. More to come, hopefully, assuming I'm alive. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.